Welcome to the second plenary session for the Alumni Awards. We had the first session with the first two awards yesterday afternoon, the presentation of the Walter Anderson Award yesterday at the end of the Higginbotham lecture. Today we're going to award to the final two awards, the remaining two awards, the Horace Mann Award first, and then the Arthur Morgan Award. The session will be as follows. There's half an hour for each award, and we're going to keep our introductory remarks short so that the awardees can provide their remarks, and we will have a few minutes for Q&A following each of the presentations, after which we will give them a lovely plaque. So, and it really is, that is not a joke. They're really, really lovely. Not the usual plexiglass engraved, that you put somewhere. These are really lovely, and you'll see them if you haven't seen them already. I'm delighted to introduce the co-winners of the Horace Mann Award right now, or as we say this year, the Horace Mann Award. The Horace Mann Award for Victory for Humanity is named for the first president of Antioch College. In the spirit of Mann's call upon the graduating class of 1859, and we all know it because it's tattooed somewhere, to win some victory for humanity, this award recognizes alumni of Antioch College whose personal or professional activities have had a profound effect on the present or future human condition. This is the second year in a row that the Alumni Association has made the Horace Mann Award to international public health professionals, a clear indication of Antioch's global reach. Stephen Arpadi and Thea have dedicated their careers to a need that is near and dear to my heart, HIV, AIDS, and child survival, in some of the most challenging places in sub-Saharan Africa. Stephen and Don started out at Antioch on different paths, Stephen in political science and Don in environmental studies. They both credit their zoology professor, Jim Howell, with sparking their interest in medicine and their early medical work in New York City at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s with their commitment to combating HIV. Stephen received his MD from George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and completed post-medical school training at Columbia University in New York. Don received his MD from Columbia and further training at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and New England Medical Center. They both joined the ranks of international HIV warriors on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa. Don in Kinshasa, the capital of the country then known as Zaire, and in Zambia. Stephen's work has taken him to Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, South Africa, Mozambique, Rwanda, Lesotho, and Eswatini, the country formerly known as Swaziland. I too spent more than 2 decades working on HIV in sub-Saharan Africa. We didn't knowingly cross paths in Eastern or Southern Africa, so it gives me great pleasure to share the stage with them back here in Yellow Springs. So I welcome first Don to present a few remarks. He will be followed by Stephen, and then we'll have Q&A.
Can you hear me in the back?
Yes. Yep.
Thanks, Karen. I'll try to keep my remarks limited to 45 minutes. Oh, 12 minutes? Let me paraphrase Bob Fogarty from yesterday. I will be academically brief. In February of 1944, my parents, Edith Schultz and Stanley Thea, got married in Rockford Chapel. And 9 years later, I was born, and I think I can probably safely say that I am a result of one of the first student unions at Antioch College. And even though I was built in 1953, I think I'm probably in more decrepit condition than the one that's on the other side of the campus. If you leave New York and you travel on Route 80 outside of New York back towards Yellow Springs, and you take exit 56 north along Route 23, you come to a small town called Pompton Lakes. And in Pompton Lakes is the Pompton Reformed Church, which is a very conservative church. And it is, in the back of that church is a small cemetery. And in that cemetery, you would find a Clayton, who is the father, who died in 1983. And you would find Doris, who is the mother, who died in January of 1985. And the third grave that you find there is James C. Howell, who died on Christmas Eve, 1985. And he died in a plane crash on his way from Chile to Antarctica. And there was a front-page New York Times article describing it. And in that article, the quote from the U.S. ambassador in Chile stated, "Whether they knew each other or just happened to be in the same plane as one another, we don't know." We do know. We do know that that plane contained 10 men, all ornithologists, all gay men, who were traveling together to go to Antarctica to go bird watching. And this was a remarkable time in Jim's life, because Jim had come out as an Antioch professor not that long before that. And it was a very, very brave act on his part. And it took him a long time, and there were a number of us that lived that decision with him. And he, a few months before he took that plane trip, he wrote me a letter, and he said, quote, "Like a bird migrating through the night, the dawn finds me exhausted, having overflown the land far out over the pathless sea." Ever the ornithologist, but incredibly prophetic for what was to happen several months later. Jim Howell was an absolute inspiration to me, to Stephen, I think to other science alumni, to Peter Brady, to Dan Levy, to many of us. He was a consummate scientist. He was rigorous about his teaching, and he really instilled in us an appreciation both for science, the rigor, and all of the detail of science, but also the discipline and the fact that it's really important that you do science of consequence. And it was that really affected me and put me on my path to do science of consequence. And if I could summarize the kind of work that I've done, which is limited in part to HIV but not completely, it is doing work where we generate evidence that can be translated very quickly into policy, given to the WHO or given to ministers of health, so that our findings can be translated into actions on the part of the public health system. So it's not science that is the discovery of antigens or anything like that. Getting this award is really a remarkable experience, because it sort of takes you away from the grant writing and the paper writing and all of the things that are associated with the details of doing science, and makes you step back and think, all right, let me consider what my career has been. And this career for us has been 35 years, a long time. But our particular focus has had a very concrete beginning, and I won't say an end yet, but it has a crescendo. And that concrete beginning for me, and I think similar to with Stephen, was 1981, when I was an intern on the wards, my first month in New York City in internal medicine, and it was a month after the first reports of HIV came out of Los Angeles. We began to see on the wards something that we had no idea of what was happening. And over the ensuing months and then years, we found ourselves in the middle of this maelstrom of doom and gloom. It was an absolutely astounding place to be in the middle of this happening. And for the next 20 years, we would be grappling with something that was an absolute death sentence, and was also associated with tremendous stigma, tremendous shame, tremendous social inequity. And it was something that was very profound. I personally signed the death certificate for about a dozen friends and friends of friends in New York City because they were dying at home, because they were hopeless, there was nothing to do, and they were ashamed. They didn't want to leave their apartments. I teach graduate students at Boston University, and I can't, it's very, very difficult for me to communicate the urgency, the fear, the panic that was going on at that point. It was actually a very privileged place to be put in the middle of that kind of evolving epidemic, and that epidemic could have been worse than any epidemic since the time of the 1400s. In part because it was sexually transmitted, it was lethal, but it was also one in Africa, outside of the United States, that was going to eviscerate the population. Typical infectious diseases afflict the youngest and the oldest. HIV was going to core out the productive part, oops, sorry about that, was going to pull out the core of the society. So it was on track to decimate lots and lots of parts of the developing world. So Steve and I sort of have had a Forrest Gump experience with this evolving epidemic over the period of time, being there in the beginning, being there in the middle, and being there in the end. Stephen will tell you about his experiences in Africa. My experiences in Africa brought me beyond HIV. They brought me to the intersection of abject poverty, like I saw in what is now the DRC, living in Kinshasa for 3 years, and all infectious diseases. And my interests sort of broadened out beyond that to all infectious diseases. But we live in very dark times, but what I wanted to do was to leave you with a little bit of optimism. Because over the course of the last 35 years, we have averted a global disaster. We have been able, through a network of scientists and public health experts, we have been able to turn back the tide of what was going to be a global disaster. To date, 70 million people have been infected with HIV. 35 million of them have died. About 35 million people in the world are still living with HIV. But 60% of those people are on antiretroviral medications. A remarkable achievement. The mother-to-child transmission rate, which was my special area of focus, has gone from 40% to less than 2%. A remarkable achievement. I mean, it really, really is. The global death rate due to HIV has halved in the last 8 years. A remarkable achievement. And it's because of this global consortium of public health specialists and scientists that have worked very tirelessly, have developed new tools, and have worked together to apply those new tools in ways that previously were thought not possible. There is a study that we reviewed. I have a podcast. I won't give you a shameless plug. It's called Free Associations, where we review scientific articles. And in that podcast, we reviewed a paper which showed that individuals who are HIV infected but on antiretrovirals and in a relationship with somebody who is HIV negative cannot transmit the virus. A remarkable accomplishment. And that has led us to actually entertain the thought of the eradication of HIV from the surface of the earth. So it's the same story with global health writ large. And I won't go through the statistics because I just got timed out, and I will stop. But what I want to do is I want to quote Sam Adams. Jonathan Mann, we own Horace Mann to a certain extent, Antioch does, but Horace Mann spent a lot of time in Massachusetts also. And 57 years before Horace Mann said his famous quote, John Adams paraphrased him, if you can do that in time. And John Adams said, "To be good and to do good is all we have to do. Thank you.
So Don said it all, and I just want to thank you all for this. I don't know, yeah. We talked about this. I said you should go first. I was very moved on. So I'm sincerely grateful to the Alumni Board for this award and for Karen for organizing the session. But I also I want to thank my friends from the classes around us for showing up this year. It's not even a round number for a reunion, but it's really very kind of you. But I also want to say, more than honored, I'm probably deeply embarrassed. I mean, have you looked at who the prior recipients were? So, are you kidding? But I also really want to acknowledge with gratitude my time here at Antioch. And it's been said before, but really I think my moral and ethical bearings were really, if not shaped here, were really solidified here. And I think we all committed ourselves to at least, not necessarily always to do the right thing, but to really struggle to do the right thing. And I think that's been an enduring part that's sustained me on what has been at times a very difficult path. So it is really difficult to talk about 30 plus years of global AIDS work in 12 minutes. Let the record show that the time is divided by award, not by awardee. So, and we thought of organizing a protest, actually. And if you all wanted to get up now, that would be a great, actually, personal relief, because then I wouldn't have to go on. But I did want to sort of zoom in a bit and just talk a little bit, mostly about some of my New York City experiences with children. And I think just to acknowledge that for a lot of us, this is personal. You know, John Byrne was a classmate of ours, graduated in '75, and it was here that John actually, in South Gym, where he found himself as a dancer and choreography, and it was also here where John became comfortable with his gayness. And John went to New York City and really had a meteoric rise in the New York City dance scene. And in 1988, John died a miserable, painful death from AIDS. There are also other people here in this audience who have lost many, some of our classmates and some friends of friends of friends and lovers. So it's really difficult to really wrap your brain around this kind of biblical human suffering that we've seen in our lifetime. But there have been, as Don mentioned, there have been some really extraordinary victories and successes, and I just want to talk a little bit about, and again, Don acknowledged the heroic activists who refused to go quietly to their deaths, and the untiring efforts of medical scientists, and this weird brew of politicians, Hollywood celebrities, and bureaucrats that really helped bring about this really extraordinary, I guess you could say, experiment in global health, where putting 20 million plus people onto what at the time seemed like impossibly challenging lifetime of treatment seemed like a pipe dream. But for many, it's really a prayer answered. To be part of that has really been, as John said, a real privilege. So I also really want to acknowledge my friends, my family, my patients, their loved ones who really helped keep me on this path. So I thought I would just tell two short stories. One is sort of from the bad old days, but really I think it's a story that doesn't get told often enough, and I think it's a story that continues today, sadly, around the world. So this is, in 1990, I became the director of an HIV program for children and their families at the St. Luke's Hospital in New York City. Us pediatricians learned pretty early on that moms and dads would bring their children in for treatment, often neglecting their own health. So I decided that we would bring the doctor to them, and that's actually where Don comes in, because Don literally, he and I worked side by side, where Don would see the moms and the dads, and I would see their kids, same place, same day. And over time, this kind of family-centered model grew to include psychologists, social workers, nutritionists, play therapists. We actually had a pet therapist that would come by. We actually had to get the dog a hospital ID. True story. Took a long time. So in the late evening of 1992, and it was October, because I remember I had just come back to work after my youngest daughter, Charlotte, had been born. I received a phone call from Marceline. I've changed the names, obviously, but this is one of the women in our program, and it was concerning her daughter, Melissa, who was 5 at the time. Marceline was in her late 20s, and she had recovered from heroin addiction and was struggling with serious psychiatric illness. She actually had an insane but beautiful smile and a wry, really absurdist sense of humor, which we all enjoyed when she wasn't actually being upset with us about the situation that she was in. She was also thoroughly estranged from her family. And Marceline called that night to say that she was worried about her daughter's breathing and was waiting for the ambulance to take her to the hospital emergency room. And by the time I met her there, Melissa had died. Melissa, and it was not an unexpected death. Melissa had suffered from this something called AIDS, multifocal leukoencephalopathy, which is to say the brain is attacked and it's inexorably fatal. And we had decided that there was, and Marceline had decided that there was little point for any heroic efforts and that to sustain her life with more painful procedures only to face more suffering and pain in the weeks or days ahead made little sense. So we sat in the room together with the social worker on call, and I asked if there was someone I could call for her, and there was no one to call. So we left, and Marceline, sorry, this happened to me before. Marceline and I walked out to Amsterdam on 113th Street with her pushing an empty stroller, and I helped her in a cab for her to go home. That level of aloneness and isolation is not something one forgets. But I also want to tell you a very different story, and this is about an email I received 3 weeks ago. And I was sort of preparing this talk, and I said, this is a great thing, particularly after that last thing. So I got an email from Braulio. So Braulio is now 24, and Braulio moved to Florida a couple of years ago, where he took a job in a management level job in a local cell phone company. And he had been among the last children with perinatally acquired HIV. So in New York State, in part and thanks to some of Don's fine work, we've all but eradicated mother-child transmission by identifying women during pregnancy and treating them. Braulio was unlucky, obviously, in that respect, but he was fortunate in that being able to, his mom and us, with the crummy drugs we had available early on, being able to sustain his life until 1996, when we suddenly were able to put together some very potent and effective drugs. So So Braulio is now in his mid-20s, and the email he sent me was a picture of his newborn, healthy baby son, and with him and his wife, who is his high school sweetheart, both of whom are quite healthy. And so by virtue of Braulio being undetectable, his viral load being well controlled, and his now wife being on PrEP, which is another long story that we could talk a little bit about. She's healthy and their son is healthy. And so I tell this story probably with a little less triumphalist spirit than perhaps Don, really just to say what is possible, but really just to point out that this is not the reality for all of us, and that that homophobia, that stigma and discrimination, that racism, that corporate greed, corruption, and indifference really continue to block the way for that other 40% of those living with HIV among us get treatment. And despite our huge success in reducing mother-to-child transmission, there's still about 160,000 babies who contract HIV on an annual basis, hopefully smaller numbers each year, and more, hopefully, of the, I should mention that we have about 2 million young people who are on treatment from perinatal HIV infection. But again, that's merely about half who need it. So there's quite a lot has been achieved with quite a lot to do. And really, just once again, thank you for this opportunity to speak to you all about it and for your seeming to pay attention. So thank you.
Well, I'm inspired, almost enough to go back to work. I'm going to suggest that we have a slight change in our program and that we hold the Q&A until after our next award, and then we'll bring back our first two awardees to be on the table in front of you with Larry Pearl, and a general Q&A. That'll get us closer to back on schedule. Or you can stay. But before, wait, there's more. I'd like to present the plaques that we have prepared for the award to our awardees. These plaques are prepared every year by a local artist, Beth Holyoke, and you probably have heard about her in previous sessions. If you haven't, then come up afterwards and we'll tell you more about her. So let me present the plaques. I think somebody needs to take some pictures, and we'll get on to the next. And if we're not taking pictures, that's okay too. You don't need me.
Horace Mann. I suggested that just because we're short of time. Okay, good. I bet you will.
Hello again. I have the extreme honor to introduce our next awardee, the Arthur Morgan Award, which is given for people, alums and friends who are supportive of community and their work has enhanced community. Larry Pearl is the recipient this year, and not only is he just an amazing person for the work that he's done, but he's a friend and neighbor in Washington, D.C. And he grew up in Philadelphia as a lawyer. He graduated from Antioch College and then went on to Yale Law School, and his continuation of activities in life with Antioch includes being on the Alumni Board twice, being on the Board of Trustees, being an active participant in the DC area alumni community, the chapter. And in his federal career started in 1961, and he retired 37 years later as acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Program Operations and Compliance in the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And the issue of fair housing is one around the country, but he's also been involved locally. In Washington, D.C., we have housing issues. Along the way, he headed a variety of offices responsible for enforcing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and ensuring that all HUD programs, housing and urban development programs, provide equal opportunity, and promote fair housing. So I think I'll just close this introduction by saying that reflect on how hard it is for some of us and some of our friends to come to Antioch. Reflect on how hard it is to leave Antioch, either because we don't really want to leave or because we haven't finished our credits or whatever. But Larry had an incredibly hard time coming to Antioch this week. He got on a flight from Washington, D.C., which was delayed, and then delayed, and then delayed. And he got halfway, when it finally took off to go to Dayton, he got halfway to Dayton, and it turned around and went back to Washington, D.C. And on the same plane, they took off later, and he did arrive here with his wife, and he doesn't always have that hard a time coming back to Antioch, but this time he did, and it's a great honor for me to have been asked to introduce Larry Pearl.
Oh, one more thing, and that is that
I also got to know Larry because he has volunteered how many years at the American Civil Liberties Union in Washington, D.C., where my husband went initially as a volunteer, and then when he realized he could be more help as a lawyer, he went to law school at night while volunteering at ACLU, and then was a staff attorney working regularly with Larry. So we have that rapport as well.
Well, that sounds very incestuous, Karen. I'll leave that. I'll accept the reward for the difficulty of getting out here. But first, I want to say that I am grateful and humbled by the award. And that's a hard act to follow, believe me. That gratitude extends to the college, as almost all the awardees have noted appropriately, and to my family and to mentors, bosses, and some good luck. Why did I come to Antioch? Well, that's good luck to start with. I had a neighbor, a high school companion, who lived around the corner, who talked up Antioch, and I never knew why. I think he attended Antioch at some point, and I can't remember what really grabbed me. The 2 points that I sort of think made a difference. One was the co-op program. That sounded great. And the other was the location, Ohio. I had never been west of Pittsburgh. So I thought I'd be a math major. I really love batting averages of my beloved Philadelphia Phillies, no longer my team. Antioch changed those plans. But one freshman story that I have to share, I was in Breton fall, and we were meeting one of the girls' dorms, one of those meet and greet things where you go down the line shaking hands. Another guy in my dorm, his name was Richard Hale, and he went by Rich. So I'm going down the line, I'm Larry, and he's saying, I'm Rich. He's going down the line, I'm Rich, I'm Jane, and so on and so forth. He goes down the line, I'm Rich, and this young woman says, I'm wealthy. Wait a minute. Her name was Wealthy Halstead. Yes. Without the A, it's probably a family name, okay. And, and they got married and lived happily ever after. That didn't happen. But the things you remember, that was one. And of course, the professors, John Sparks and Heinz Uhlau in government. I did like Parker Hamilton in math, but I got sort of moved over. The first job off campus was in Cleveland, Ohio. Again, Ohio, really love that place. Hadn't been to Lake Erie before. November and December, coldest 2 months of my life. That wind off Lake Erie, I can still remember it, walking to the bus. This was working with it wasn't called urban renewal then because it was pre-54, but it was community development, and it was run by an ex-Antiochian, if I remember, and it sort of introduced me to the housing area. It was an education, but the real education came in looking for housing in Cleveland. With me were Vic Rossi, white like me, and Cleland Van Laer, African, not African American, African from Gold Coast, now Ghana. So the three of us were looking for furnished apartments, 2 months, like many of you elsewhere, and we looked at ads in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and then we went out and we called first, is it still available? Oh yes. And we tried to get there, pretty soon after the call. And gosh, what a coincidence. Those places were rented even before we got there. It's amazing. That's just strange. Well, being budding college students, we figured out what was going on. And so Cleland and Vic went to the Y, and I, whose freshman roommate was from Cleveland, another piece of luck, so I stayed with his parents, and for a few days we kept at it, and finally found a woman in Cleveland Heights who rented us a place. Gave us the fisheye a little, but oh, and I should mention that at one point, after all these turndowns, we thought, oh, I know what, Vic and I can go, and then Cleveland will show up later after we sign the lease, right? Oh yeah, sure, but we wouldn't do that. We were upstanding college students, right? So, as I say, we stuck at it, and we finally prevailed and found a decent place. And the only problem was occasionally when we ate out, we might be seated near the kitchen, but that was the worst of it. So, I had 3 jobs in DC. Wonder why I ended up there. Actually, one of them, I mentioned how cold I was in Cleveland. One of them was in the top deck of the Library of Congress, which in those days was not air conditioned, and this was May and June. So Antioch exposed me to climate change. I went on to, I should say first that Heinz Ulau knew about Social Science Research Council Fellowship, which I never would have heard of, and they gave a fellowship to people who had not been in the social sciences in college. I was in government. That's obviously not a social science, but of course at Antioch, of course it was. Sociology, anthropology, history, all that stuff, but I was eligible. And so I got the fellowship, and I went to Cambridge for 1 year in the Harvard Graduate School of Social Relations, which was a wonderful experience. And I think I knew I wanted to go on to law school. But one of the things in Cambridge, speaking of where you live, we lived, I remember the address, on 29 Lawrence Street in Cambridge. That was 1/2 block from the corner of Lawrence and Pearl Street. Wait, what? No, that can't, no, that's like wealthy and rich. You can't. That actually happened. So I went on to Yale Law School. I was not the student at Yale Law School. I was at Antioch. Oh, the competition. But so I wasn't on the law review. But what I did do was co-edit a leisurely journal of political satire called Monocle. Wonderful, wonderful experience. And the first job was in Washington. It was with a law firm that my father, who was a Philadelphia lawyer, had some contact with. And they did mostly tax work, a little boring, but it was in education. And the one problem with that was that I think one of the partners in a spare moment mentioned to me that they represented Republican tax evaders. I'm not making that up. And so after a year, I thought, okay, that was that experience. But during that year, I accepted an appointment to represent a criminal defendant. Lawyers should do that, right? And my client was accused of robbery, and we had a trial, and he was convicted and sentenced to 5 to 15, and I retired from the courtroom the opposite of undefeated. But it was a good experience, a learning experience, let's call it. And you know what lawyers wear to the courtroom, of course. They wear lawsuits, right? So President Kennedy said, ask not what you get from the government, ask what you know, whatever he said. So I joined the Housing and Home Finance Agency in 1961. I made the rookie mistake of going to the personnel office instead of the general counsel's office when looking for a legal job. Couldn't do that. So I finally got back on track. And I worked for a wonderful supervisor, a guy named Eddie Levette, who was, I think, the only African-American attorney at the Housing and Home Finance Agency at the time that I was hired. Ed was great. He was a wonderful draftsman and had experience with the NAACP, and just that was a terrific experience, and certainly a good bit of luck as well. Then came HUD, which was created in 1965. That was a successor to HHFA. And the first secretary appointed by President Johnson was Robert Weaver. He was the first African-American head of a government agency. And before I left the general counsel's office, I guess it was about the time that Weaver was appointed, there was something called the National Commission on Urban Problems. It was headed by former Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois, called the Douglas Commission, now NCUP. And what they did was hold hearings all around the country. It was the height of the civil rights strife. They actually had a hearing scheduled in Detroit, which was called off because of the riots, rescheduled later. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go around the country with them and see what was going on in many cities around the country at the height of the civil rights movement in the 60s. The commission regarded me as the HUD spy, and I wrote up reports after the meetings for the secretary, mostly in writing, and I remember at least one face-to-face with the Secretary Weaver. The Fair Housing Act came in 1968, a week after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And George Romney was appointed by the HUD secretary by Richard Nixon, who was elected later in 1968. Romney was a wonderful secretary from my standpoint as a civil rights attorney. And he picked a guy named Samuel J. Simmons as the first assistant secretary for then called Equal Opportunity, later Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And the fortunate thing was I knew Sam Simmons. I knew his family, and he was great. He had been in Detroit, which is how Romney knew him, and then he was working for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in Washington at the time he was selected. So Sam asked me to come up from the general counsel's office and be detailed to him because he knew I had been in housing all those years. And I said, great. And after, I think it was maybe 3 weeks, he said, why don't you stay here as my special assistant with a promotion? And I said that was an offer that I couldn't refuse. And so the rest of my career in government and HUD was in fair housing. And I stayed as his special assistant, but you have to understand what HUD was like at the time. As I say, Romney was good on civil rights, as was his undersecretary, who also came from Detroit. But you had the head of the Federal Housing Administration, who was a home builder from North Carolina. You had the head of public housing, who was the Southside Virginia public housing. And you had the general counsel, who was sort of the White House spy, if you will, a guy named Herman Unger, who would run the president's campaign in Ohio. Another coincidence. And the thing that stands out to me, to give you an idea of the kinds of things that went on, we were working on a handbook to implement Title VIII, the fair housing law that I mentioned a minute ago. And we had to have a meeting. There were a couple of issues to be resolved. So, okay, we'll get together, Simmons and Unger and their staffs, and we can probably take care of it, in a half hour or whatever. So we get in this room together, and we're sitting across from each other. And my boss, Sam, says, Sherm, we have this couple of issues, but I think we can probably dispose of them here. And Unger says, no, Sam, no. The issue today is how you, in fair housing, your people are taking over the role of the general counsel's office. And Sam was just taken aback. And he said, no, Sherm, I do have some lawyers. He actually had everybody. Sam was not a lawyer, but all the people sitting beside him, including me, were attorneys. And he said, no, I have these lawyers, but we defer to you on general counsel issues. And Unger said, are you calling me a liar? You're calling me a liar. And he stood up and walked out of the room. And when he did that, of course, his staff followed him. So we're sitting there opposite a blank slate on the other side. It took 6 months for the two of them to talk together, with the undersecretary finally getting them back together. That was the kind of thing we went with. So it was an exciting time. And as Karen said, I worked on a variety of programs through the years, which was a great experience, and retired as this title, one of those Washington titles that go on forever. But it was a wonderful experience. And after retirement, I tried to keep my hand in. I have developed this online course on the history of housing discrimination from the Civil War to 1968 for the National Fair Housing Training Academy. Karen mentioned that I volunteer with ACLU. Just one note, we get all sorts of calls. I handle intake. We get calls from all over the country because people think we're the national office. We're not. It's in New York. But fine. People want to tell their stories. That's something always you remember. Someone else mentioned that, I think. Even though I can hear in the first sentence that it's not something that ACLU can handle, or maybe we can refer them to somebody, but they want to tell their story, and it's my job to let them do that. Felt more like a therapist than a lawyer, but that's what comes with a territory. Except for this one guy, this was right after 9/11, and he called and he said, will you do something for me? No idea what he was, and I said, sir, what did you have? Say God bless America. I was really nonplussed with that, and I sort of was getting my back up a little bit. I said, well, you know, we don't do that here. I didn't say that, so finally, so he went back. No, just say it. So I finally, violating protocol, hung up. Okay. Phone rings immediately again. Same guy, same conversation. I hang up again. The third time he calls, he's singing God Bless America off key. So that's been interesting. Okay. One last thing is that on a more serious note, black wealth is today 5% of white wealth. After the Fair Housing Act, black ownership increased for 30 years to nearly 50% in 2004, but those gains were wiped out in the Great Recession, thanks to the subprime mortgage crisis and other such things. So black home ownership now is only 42%, compared to 72% for whites. Compare redlining in the 30s with foreclosures. I saw a map a couple of years ago in a fair housing conference. Sacramento, here's the map for the areas that were redlined. Here are the foreclosures. You could not tell the difference in those maps. So there's still a lot to be done, but I'm very glad that I was along for at least part of the ride. Thank you.
So, if Mr. Cameron could come down again. And Larry, it is a great honor for me to be able to personally hand this over to you. Again, all of these plaques are made by Beth Holyoke here in Yellow Springs, and Larry is well deserved. Thank you, Cameron.
Okay, this is quite inspiring. The clock is conspiring against us. We have 5 minutes in the session left, and we will have to end on time because we have a very special session coming up celebrating lives and legacies. So I think we have time for 2, maybe 3 comments, questions, and we have the microphones coming.
I just wanted to ask Stephen Arpadi, could you just say 3 words about the diuretic properties of beer?
what I want to know is who put you up to that? Because last time I said, some like wiseacre is going to ask me, what's the mechanism for the diuretic effects of beer? And I asked several different physicians and physiologists at dinner, and nobody could answer it. So that's, I'm afraid, Jim, I forgot.
I'm Jim Hobart, and I'm on the nominating committee that chose you people. I've known Larry a long time because we were in school, although not classmates at the same time. And then I was given the honor to call each of you and ask you to accept this award. And I really had some trepidation about that. I figured, that last week you'd been offered a Nobel Peace Prize or another form of Nobel Prize. So I called you, and it just amazed me, sort of the innocent surprise that Antioch would do this. So the question is, I know in my case, if I get my feet a little off the ground, there are two people that get me back on my path, and one is my wife and the other is my daughter. So what in your life keeps you balanced and aware of the realities?
That's for all three of them?
Yes, for all three of them.
And it's probably our last one.
I would say, Jim, like you, certainly my wife, and I would certainly add my children. When you say keep you on balance, when I have a contest with my eldest daughter every Sunday around the New York Times puzzle on spelling bee, that definitely keeps me balanced.
I think some would argue if I've remained on balance. But I probably want to paraphrase a quote from LaShawn yesterday of that we do stand on the shoulders of others. And, I wasn't kidding when I looked at the list of prior recipients. And so I think, I don't know, it's probably, I don't know how to answer. I don't know how to answer that, but I think some perspective about the things that that matter, and I think that's one of also the gift of medicine is some sense of what does matter. Although I have to confess, that's a rather it doesn't last very long. I'll still go home, and if I ran out of toothpaste, it's like that nothing could be worse. So.
When I first got your email, I thought it was spam. I really did not believe it. And then I called you up, and you were real. We had a real conversation. I think experiences like this keep me grounded. Coming back to Yellow Springs and being amidst a community that is indelible in me keeps me grounded. It's similar to the community that I've built in the scientific community and the colleagues that I've worked with, but it's about the work, and it's about the reward of your friends and your colleagues, and certainly the patients and the people that we're working for.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all, our awardees. Thank you all our community members, our friends, for coming. We will start again in this room in 15 minutes for celebrating lives and legacies. So I hope to see you again. Thank you.
Since I have the mic, I'll make a comment rather than a question, Donnie and Steve. And there are moments in your careers when all three of you, Larry, Don, and Steve, stared into some of the most difficult situations that any of us can imagine. And you persisted, and you found the depth of character in yourselves to keep going with that. And we want to say thank you.